So as you may have heard, the highly influential American author Cormac McCarthy recently died. There have been a lot of major deaths in literature this year so far, Hilary Mantel being a big one. But for whatever reason I was most drawn to talk about a book from Cormac McCarthy, and I couldn't really tell you why. He was often considered one of the great American writers, and he's considered to have written one of the great American novels. I wouldn't go that far to put that kind of label on it, but I would say he is a great American writer, and he has written some great books. But I don't know if I would call any of them that. But I am a big fan of his work, more for the ideas behind them. I'm not sure why, but I really wanted to reread one of his books. You could say I was drawn by fate to do it, but I'm sure Cormac McCarthy would chastise me for seeing the world like that. I've read a few of Cormac McCarthy's books. I've read The Road, of course. I've read All the Pretty Horses. I've read about half of Blood Meridian. I'm going to come back to it. Definitely, I'm going to come back to it. And I've read No Country for Old Men, which is probably my favourite of his. The main reason why I wanted to talk about No Country for Old Men, apart from it being probably his most recognisable, because of the amazing movie that's based off it, but also because it feels like the one that distills the most of his, like, moral ethic, and the most of his... what makes Cormac McCarthy... like his staples, his tropes, what you get when you read one of his books, you get all of when you read No Country for Old Men, I think. Or at least the most of. There's a lot of different kind of style and passage construction and theme that people expect from a Cormac McCarthy book, and I think all of them are in this one, as opposed to some being in each of his works, but not all of them. I'd say all of them are in No Country for Old Men. I love this book so much. As I said, it is my favourite. It's the most complex one I've read from him. It's the one that's doing the most. It's a very detailed, complicated book that's saying a lot, more than The Road or All the Pretty Horses for my money. It's saying a lot about the soul of America and how much society has changed and what is valued and how people value it. An Australian publication called McCarthy, The Dark Counter-Narrative to American Optimism, and I just thought that was a really funny but also quite apt way of viewing his writing, and it's best expressed in this one. McCarthy is telling us all the time about the nature of evil and of fate, and he has this kind of moral ground that he sits on, and it's the best in this book. Or, not the best, but the most notable. He's really... it has a real heightened sense of moral teaching in this book, where he's saying, this is what happens when you view life a certain way, this is what happens when different frameworks of viewing the world collide, when different psychologies interact, and it's important to view the world with that kind of lens over it. His characters are often very alien, especially to one another, and his books are always got about what the world is in the lack of God, what it's like if there was no order to things, and how God establishes his will in a world that's totally desolate. And The Road is a post-apocalyptic setting, and that's probably the most literal interpretation of that, but No Country for Old Men has that as well, and No Country for Old Men puts that quite directly in a really distinctly Western setting. Western in the sense of the kind of tropes that you'd expect from a Western book or a Western movie, less so than just location. His books treat the landscape as if it's like one bad move or one bad decision away from all the characters just like falling into hell, with hell just opening up and everyone falling into it. And there seems to be some kind of invisible thing that pulls people together and keeps people from doing that, from falling into hell. There's just something that keeps them afloat, and in this book it's probably money, but there's things that guide the characters and things that cause the narrative to unfold the way it does that are kind of beyond even Anton Chigurh's comprehension. Anton Chigurh is the main villain of the book, of course. He's this psychopathic hitman, played by Javier Bardem in the movie, of course. And my favourite part of this book, and probably my favourite part of any Cormac McCarthy book, is the way his character gets sent off and the way the book treats him. So throughout the whole book, he has this feeling that he understands fate the best. He understands how order works. He has this feeling of himself as akin to God, in the sense that what he does happens. Whenever he acts, the things that he wants to have happen. And so the most satisfying end to that character is to not have him die, but to have God re-establish his will over him and tell him not to fuck with him in that way. And that's with Chigurh getting hit by a car, and he's totally not expecting that, and he limps off with his arm in a sling, and that's the last you see of him, because he's and that's him losing. He's lost, because the scene before that point, Josh Brolin, Llewellyn Moss, Josh Brolin's wife has told him that he is deciding what to do with people himself. It's not fate doing that for him. He views himself as an agent of fate, but in reality he views himself as a kind of god. And I think her name's Carla Jean, tells him, well, it's not the coin that's doing it, it's just you. You have the choice to not shoot me. And he goes, well, no, I don't. And he shoots her, and then as he leaves the house, he gets hit by a car, and he didn't expect that. So that's the way that God is telling him, well, there is such a, like, I exist, that is what's happened. So it's almost like, that almost uplifts the ending, because it tells you that the invisible force that's been moving through the book is not Anton Chigurh, it's a god or something else. And that's the kind of way that the divine fate kind of restores itself. So it's such a satisfying and complicated end to the character. And I just fucking love this book. I remember in the movie where Josh Brolin gets, like, killed off screen, I was like, what the fuck? And it's a totally surprising moment. And then when you read the book, that feels so stitched into the narrative. It feels almost inevitable that he would die in the way he does. And that, of course, feeds back into Anton Chigurh, because he wasn't the one to kill him. And that's almost the mask slipping at that point, where Anton is not the agent of fate that he thought he was, where he's like, right, I'm going to kill Josh Brolin and I'm going to be the one to do it, and then Josh Brolin gets killed by some random characters off screen, and then that's at the beginning of Anton losing, which is very satisfying and totally makes sense in the narrative. But at the same time, it's such a sidestep, it's such an abstract move, like it is a left turn. If you're going to read the plot synopsis of this on Wikipedia, it comes as a left turn, but in the book it really doesn't. It feels like it has to happen. There's an inevitability to the whole book in the first 80% of it that then gets kind of subverted near the end, and that's where the book really comes into its own. I love that last scene in the book of Llewellyn flirting with the waitress, and he's kind of, it's the most you see him as the kind of cowboy, bad boy, kind of flirty character that you'd expect in some Western literature. You'd expect Clint Eastwood to talk to a woman that way or something like that. And that's the last scene you see of him before he gets shot down, and that was the most it reminded me of a typical Western, when in reality the whole book is about trying to subvert that and kill that. If you were to treat this book as being set in the time of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and Josh Brolin is this rootin' tootin' cowboy, then his death fucks with that, and the whole arc of the character fucks with that, and the narrative totally ends it. Llewellyn's last line in the book too is really great and stuck with me. Well, darling, you're just a little late, 'cause I done bought, and I think I'll stick with what I got. And that's the last line he speaks before he gets shot by the Mexicans, and I thought that was like a perfect line, perfect summation of the character, basically, and his kind of like, he has a different type of will to Chigurh, but he's equally as sort of strong-willed about things. It's just that God decided his time was up, which I love. I love that you can think of it like that. My God, the way this book ends is fucking insane. And The Road has the best kind of ending paragraph. It has the best send-off. But this book is like crazy. That final monologue with Ed Tom Bale, and he's talking about the dream he had of his dad carrying the fire through the mountain pass, is so profound and effective, and then the character wakes up, and that's him waking up to the way the world is now. It's fucking flawless, that ending, and I really, really love this book. Extremely powerful and very strange too. The violence in Cormac McCarthy's books, people have talked at length about that. Some of the best in literature, probably. There's a moment where the sheriff finds this woman who's been shot in the back of the head, and in the middle of all this description of like brain matter and blood, there's a single line that says, "A second shot had marked a date on a calendar on the wall behind her that was 3 days hence." And I just love that in the midst of all this description of like violence in this very matter-of-fact way, there's this single sort of chilling line that kind of doesn't really need to be there. But I just love that. I remember reading that and being like, the main thing I don't like about Cormac McCarthy's books that I think I've mentioned elsewhere is the kind of grammatical weirdness. In this book, it's almost at its worst. There's no quotation marks, but also in not flashbacks, but in interior monologues that Ed Tom Bell has, there's no punctuation at all. Abbreviated words have no apostrophes. There's barely any commas. And when he's abbreviating sort of sentences, he's written them in a way where you kind of have to say them phonetically. So, for example, instead of saying dumber than hell, the book will say D-U-M-B-E-R-N hell. Dumber than hell. You know, like, but it does that a lot, and it doesn't, it just comes through the narrative, you know what I mean? There's no punctuation around that word. So it's a really weird thing, and it's something you have to get used to, but it makes it feel like it was written as a first draft, and I mean that in a good way. It makes it feel like this has been something that struck him and he's had to write it all down incredibly quickly. That's how it feels. I know it isn't that case, but it feels like he's had to really quickly, like, oh fuck, I've got to finish this before my, I don't know, my time is up or something. But he writes it out like he's been kind of struck by divine inspiration. He has to quickly pound it out on a typewriter. But yeah, I mean, I think it's at its most extreme here, and it does take me out of it at points, but I have to say that I love the subject matter of the book enough that it doesn't affect me too much. The amount I connect on the style and how kind of bombastic it is at points is dependent from book to book on how engaged I am with them. And with this book I am the most engaged, so I'm able to kind of sink into it a little more. I would also say that I prefer the Anton Chigurh of the movie. I think the one in the book states his case too much. I think he speaks too much, and I think he also says the point of his character too much about fate, and I don't know, it feels like his philosophy comes out too much, whereas in the movie it happens like maybe once or twice. They have the line where it's like, if it was a rule that got you here, then of what use was the rule? You know? And that's in the book as well, but it's accompanied by a lot of other reiterations of that point that I don't think need to be there. I would say the focus on Ed Tom Bell in the book is the major difference from the movie, because the book really goes in on him. And I think at the beginning of every chapter there's an italicized page or so that's like some dream he's had or some recollection he's having. And I think that happens way too many times. I think it only needs to happen 3 or 4 times, but it happens at the beginning of every chapter. And that's where all the quotation marks are gone, and all the grammar's really fucky. And I don't think that it needs to be that much. That was the only major criticism I had when I shut the book for the 2nd or 3rd time I've read it, was like, nah, you could have cut some of that out. And the book's already so brisk, but it really feels like it comes to a bit of a halt whenever it gets to one of those points. That's my only major criticism with the book though, and it's easily my favourite of the 3 or 4 that I've read from him. I would say now that he's dead, people are looking back on his work and deciding what's his best, what book summarizes him the best, how should people start with his writing. And personally, I feel like No Country for Old Men's a really good place to start reading him. I feel like the road's almost like too much too fast, and All the Pretty Horses is not very distinctive from him. It's actually quite a nice book. So I would say if you're going to start with reading his books, read No Country for Old Men, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to talk about it. He was a great author, very dark, very strange. He had a really interesting lens through which he viewed the world, and his plots are always so unique. He is considered one of the great American authors, and I'm sure in 50 or 60 years books of his will be used to define certain points that the world is at any given time. But I would say that in the case of No Country for Old Men, I very much love it, and it's a hard recommend from me. But yeah, if you haven't read any of his books yet, you should definitely check him out.